Okay, welcome back for a new episode. Today we have Miss Briyanna Jenkins, one of my old longtime friends, and I'm excited to welcome here today. Briyanna is in higher education and she's worked at various colleges and universities for over 10 years. She's a native Floridian from Lake Mary. So anybody in that Central Florida region, welcome her to the podcast today. She has a Bachelor's of Arts degree from the Florida State University, where we actually met and were roommates long time ago, so many moons ago at this point. Briyanna continued on with her education to earn her Master's of Education degree from the University of South Florida, and she is currently pursuing her doctorate degree at the University of Central Florida, where she's studying with the intersection of public affairs and higher education. Briyanna is also a member of Alpha Kappa Alpha Sorority Incorporated and NAACP. And just to put this out here to help us connect a little bit more with Miss Briyanna, she lives by the J. Cole motto, there is no such thing as a life that's better than yours. And she uses this in her everyday life and within her community. So Bri, welcome to the podcast. Would you like to give a little intro about yourself?
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Kristen, you hit it right on the head. Thank you for introducing me. I am, very happy to join you all today to kind of chat with you, and honored that you all have been able to invite me to the podcast. So thank you.
Yeah, so let's just get some things kicked off and started. So education, why education? How do you connect with that field? And then maybe giving us a little bit about your, feeling or your experience as a Black woman within education and navigating that space.
Absolutely. So I guess to start with talking about why education, for me, it really is about my family growing up. My great grandmother and all of my mother's side are from Mississippi, from a small town called West Point, Mississippi. So very heavily impacted, I think, by a lot of various things, predominantly Black, predominantly poor. And so my family, education was thought of as a way to mobilize, to change your life and change your circumstances personally. So for me, when I thought about a career, my grandmother was a teacher. All of my great aunts were teachers. My mom was a teacher, in various capacities. And so when I thought about what I wanted to do, this clicked for me. I also went, like you mentioned, to college at Florida State University. And part of what really made me chop hard, go Noles.
Yes, go Noles.
Part of what made me really like this idea was my involvement there and seeing that all of the people that I interacted with majored in education and were educators. So for me, it was a very easy thing. And as a Black woman working in education, I find that a lot of the traditional education spaces weren't designed for us. Getting a quality education as a person of color or a Black person was not even a reality until 50, 60 years ago, right? And so when we think about, for me as a practitioner, how I wanted to create and navigate spaces and open doors for other Black students, I wanted to make sure that they saw themselves in the spaces I was creating and that the educational opportunities weren't missed because of our lack of cultural awareness for what Black students go through. And so that's kind of where I feel like I relate to and choose to persist as a Black woman in education, because if I don't, then who will? and oftentimes it's not people who look like us who are doing that.
Yeah, for sure.
And if Sean was with us today, she would say, listen, okay?
Sean would be
60 years is not that long ago. And we just need to take a moment for that. We're still talking about first.
Correct.
We're still talking about only. And 50 years is just one generation,
Correct.
We've come a mighty long way, but there's still just so much work to be done. So I applaud you for working in such a space that it was not historically for us. And it's not easy to work in, especially at a predominantly white institution as well. Yeah. So the word you used was resistance. And that's really what it is. So you don't have an easy job, but thank you for sticking in there and doing it.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it's a collective effort, right? Like I cannot do the work I do by myself. I have to have allies, and I have to build those allies strategically in order to make sure that everyone's invested in the idea that I have for what I want to provide for my students, but also the idea of education as a whole. And I find that sometimes that changes depending on where you are, but agreed, it's a collective effort.
Yeah. So to that last statement, though, it changes on where you are. So right now you're the director of student conduct and interim Title IX coordinator of a university in Florida, or a state college in Florida, excuse me. But how do you feel that all comes together and brings that experience back to you, and even for your students that you're interacting with as well?
Right. I think that the place that I've chosen to work recently has most closely aligned with what I seek to do, which is create access, right? And so I work at a state college. We have both 2-year and 4-year degrees. So most of our student population are that 2-year community college, technical college student, right? Yeah. So we're not talking about students who are 18 years old or 17 years old. We're talking about students who have a life under their belt, and also students who may not have been offered the same opportunities as a lot of other students. So we're talking predominantly Black, predominantly Hispanic students. And so I strategically chose this position because I knew that this would give me the opportunity to most significantly and heavily impact those students. What's interesting though is that I don't think that in my previous role I wasn't doing that. Like in my previous roles, I was at 4-year institutions, 4-year universities, big universities. So all of the universities I worked at had over 20,000 students at them, right? So I don't think I wasn't not doing that. I was still intentionally making choices to do things. So I'll give a small example of that. I worked at a university, and at that university, I worked in housing. And housing and residence life, student affairs is not for the faint of heart. And what I found was that all of our student leaders at that university were predominantly white in a city where the demographic was half of the demographic are Black. So you have all white student leadership in a half Black city. For me, that was problematic, but obviously all my supervisors were white men. So they didn't see a problem with it, right? And so for me in those roles, in my hiring decisions, I chose to hire a staff that was predominantly Black. So you look around and that's a single decision I was able to make in that capacity with what was in my control. And so the higher I've been able to climb within higher education, I increasingly have more control over those decisions and am choosing to increasingly diversify spaces for my students. So where we started with this hiring decision to do that, I now get to make decisions about, okay, which cases am I going to pursue on behalf of the college for students, right? What type of testimony am I going to allow from a faculty member when we're talking about a Black student, right? What am I going to consider? So with greater power comes greater responsibility in that regard. But in whatever space I've chosen in higher education, I've intentionally wanted to take positions that allowed me to have a depth of responsibility and depth of access to make those choices.
Yeah, what you just said about representation is so important. And you said within your control and being able to make those decisions. I want to just emphasize that because in my conversations with so many career women, Black women, they tend to shy away from supervisory roles, leadership roles, management roles. And I understand that there's a risk and a burden associated with climbing that ladder and when you're the only one at that table. But on the flip side of that, you have to be in the room in the positions in order to affect change. And so you just articulated the direct result of what happens when we're in the room. We can open the door to bring more folks like us in and to do that sponsorship, that mentorship, and continue that cycle, which is so important. So one question I have, what are the just 2 or 3 like biggest challenges that you have seen from your role being embedded into these institutions?
So you only gave me 2 or 3, so I'm gonna try to keep it to 2 or 3.
Or 5.
I mean,
we can have part 2 if we need to.
Yeah. So we can split some of those up. But so I will honestly say, working in higher education overall is a great gig. Like, I don't want to discourage anyone from getting into higher education, especially Black women, because like you mentioned, in order for us to have seats at the table, there has to be someone there to create them. So I will say that for me, some of the challenges working in higher education is that education itself is very old as an industry and set in its ways about a lot of different things. In particular, one of the ways that I found it's been difficult to be in that space has been the ability for me to be authentic in how I express myself. I will tell you that I'm fortunate enough that my parent was a speech and language pathologist. And so she had me sitting at the table practicing my R's and my S's when I was a kid, right? And so, but I recognize that the code switch aspect of being a Black woman, when you're around your people, you are with your people, and that's how you converse. So I'll give an example of this is that with one of my colleagues, because, you know, there's always, you know, what I found is what I always like to find the other Black woman. Where is that person in that organization,
is Sean,
right?
all day.
Right. I find the other Black woman. Where is that person? I can kind of, oh, hey,
you the one. That's what she said.
Yes.
You know, wanting to know, you know, what's the real conversation, right? So we're having a conversation and it gets a little elevated because we're laughing and we're, you know, talking with each other, and it's in her office. So this is her space, right? Her supervisor comes and says, hey, would you mind if you all just lowered the volume? Now, mind you, if this were during business hours, this would be fine. But I want to add a little bit context. So this was at 5:30 at night. Right. So there are no students. There's no clients because she worked in a student service. There's no clients. There is nothing happening at this point. And so authentically, you know, we can be loud. We can be jovial and boisterous. You know, not all of us are. So I don't want to stereotype us, but that we can be when we get around people we're comfortable with. And so I found a challenge to my authenticity as a person and as a Black person in this space, because even when I am joyful, I'm not welcome in this space, right? And so that was the first thing. I think sometimes when you choose to live authentically as who you are, sometimes that authenticity, because you are a Black person, can be challenged. And you are told to act a certain way or present yourself in a certain way. Another example is that I often get told how well I speak by white people in my fields, and I find that really interesting.
It's a dig.
Because, you know, you see all these degrees on this wall, right? Like, you see who I am. So why would you think or make that as a commentary, right? So I think there's just, in addition to the challenge of authenticity, that brings me to my second point, in that there's a lack of cultural competence that has been required of people in education for a long time. What is required of them is that they're subject matter experts. So, you know, if you want to teach physics, you must know physics, you must be a physicist, right? Not that you must be good at teaching physics, you must know physics, and you must also be able to have your message received by students. A lot of times what institutions of higher education miss is they focus on the subject matter and the accolades that a person has received, but not their ability to accurately disseminate and relate to people. So you get people who have been teachers for 40 years, because education is an old field, who have never had a conversation about their own self with a student or with another person. So when they are challenged with that lack of cultural competence just comes shining through. So I think that, those are the things that I would say really affect me, because when I'm having a conversation with a faculty member about a student, most often I'm having conversations when something has gone left with a student. I often have to do a lot more heavy lifting because I have to also teach them in addition to doing my job. So I can't just do my job well. I don't get that privilege. I have to also teach someone how to receive the message that I am doing that makes me do my job well, if that makes sense. So my last point would be that it is double the work in higher education to accomplish
half the pay as well.
for half the pay. When I negotiated my salary, I was very intentional with telling my boss that very thing. She thought I was a little nuts because I said, I'm not only going to have to do my job well, I'm going to have to teach people to accept me doing my job well. So because of that, this salary that you are offering me is really cute on paper, but I'm going to need another 10% to really make that shake for me. Because if I'm going to do jobs, if I'm going to do multiple things by just being me, because it's not only I can share with a faculty member, okay, this is what I would like you to do. They're automatically going to second guess my expertise because of how I present myself. So I now have to work twice as hard to do my job well for that to be effective. And so I think there's that last part too, is that, that saying of working twice as hard just to get just as far is not something that only happened 60 years ago. It's happening now because folks are resistant to learning about cultural competence. I mean, we see, especially I work in Florida, so the woke bill is real. Like, people don't want to hear about themselves. They don't want to hear about an understanding for others. And I think that really does make things, especially in higher education, very difficult because we are so ruled by those legislative pieces and that cultural environment.
So I just have to say a couple of things are resonating with me because, Bree is on the education side and I've always been in the healthcare side, right? But to your point about in education, you're looking for a teacher who can teach physics, not necessarily about those other pieces, about being a teacher. Like, being a teacher is a social worker. It's about like checking in on your students, being able to teach a material in multiple ways so that someone can grasp it. There's different learning styles, et cetera, et cetera. And in the healthcare field, we're looking for someone who's a doctor. Are you board certified? Are you a specialist? Great, we're hiring you. But then where is the bedside manners? That's always the problem. The jokes, the comments, the rudeness, the bluntness is just accepted because you're a doctor, and I don't think that's okay. And then coming to your last point, number 3, about adding tax because I have to teach people. I personally think we need another mini episode about your negotiation tactics for some of us, because I absolutely, the moment you cross into being a manager, and this goes back to everything we've said so far, like a lot of Black and brown women don't want that because of that kind of extra step and work that you have to do out on a regular day. We're already teaching and almost asked to speak for other Black women and other Black men and the Black population anyways. But now in a manager's role, you have to teach them to respect you, teach them to respect others. I mean, I could share stories, but that would be telling of where I'm working. And some of these stories about just complete shock, like jaw hits the ground because I can't even believe someone said that to their staff members, and they're saying it in like open spaces, not even behind closed doors without witnesses to say that that didn't happen. And you are obligated to say something. And then on top of that, the perception of you being too strict, too stern, no sense of humor because you're correcting culturally incompetent comments. Like, you just can't overlook that once you become a manager.
Correct.
It's like, what's wrong with you? Don't you get it?
Yeah. Absolutely. I have never had my delivery questioned as much as I do in my job.
Yes.
And it's because I am expected to smile and look pleasant and be amenable and be happy, even in the face of blatant disrespect.
Yeah.
Because, and I truly believe this, I think it's because when people look at Black women, they assume we're angry.
Oh, yeah.
When in reality, we're justified. Solange said it best, you got a right to be mad, especially when you are struggling and wanting to persist in systems and spaces where people do things like you just mentioned.
Yeah.
And we're expected sometimes to take that because, like medicine, higher ed is a very old industry, and
old industry,
with its own norms and with its own expectations that comes with that.
It's not just an old industry too, it's an arrogant industry.
Correct.
Yes.
Correct.
It's like you are privileged, it's a privilege for you to teach at a college, on a college campus, or to be a tenured professor. That's a gift that we're giving to you. Or I have such a problem with a lot of these research conferences where you have to pay to present your work, or
Correct.
when you publish something, they're making money off of your product and you're not. So the whole institution is built on, it is a gift for you to come here, let alone people are going in debt and burning out and all kinds of things to try to achieve this American dream of college education. But it needs some dismantling. Kristen mentioned the mini episode. We just wrapped up a conversation on authenticity, and it's set out to be a mini episode, but it ended up being our longest one yet because there's just so much to uncover. And that example specifically that you mentioned about the speech, I was reading a book called Subtle Acts of Exclusion. And it's kind of the modern thinking around microaggressions, sort of retiring that term and talking about it in a way of exclusion, because that's what it is. And in that book, they use that specific example. You're so articulate. And what we know is
crawl.
because there's a difference in you come from a background of speech language pathologists. So not the pronunciation or the inflection or the accent, but how clear you deliver a message makes you articulate. And I've seen the smartest people who can never give a coherent sentence. But because it comes out of our mouths with our accents or what they expect us to sound like, they can't even understand that we are being articulate, even if we are speaking in AAVE.
Exactly. Absolutely. And when you consider that people who speak English aren't even of the global majority. The global majority of people don't even speak English and don't speak in a language that is understandable to the average American, right? So I think there's a vast amount of also privilege in that statement when you're having those conversations with people to, and then yet when I call them out and say, I always say what's understood doesn't have to be explained. So if you don't understand me, maybe it wasn't for you to understand.
And some memes on that, how people misuse.
Right.
Oh my God.
Yes, exactly. And so I agree. That's a great point to talk about, that it really is an act of exclusion to address specific behaviors by people of color and attribute them as enlightening them or elevating them above other people of color, because of how they perform them. And I think that's
if I could ask one question. So you were talking about that risk taking, or being in that position of having to teach people what to do. And you're right, the research says that people perceive our number one trait to be strong and angry.
Angry.
1 and 2.
Absolutely.
And during my research for my dissertation, I also talked about the penalty when we're in leadership. So if you're a man in leadership and you exhibit leadership traits, then you're rewarded. But if you are a female, and let alone being Black in a leadership position, and you show those same leadership traits, you're penalized. So could you talk about any time where you had to face being penalized for taking that risk of doing what's right and stepping up?
Absolutely. So I think the biggest example that comes to mind, unfortunately, there have been a few, where you make decisions that are well within your rights and role as a leader. And because of your expectations, I think specifically as a woman, you don't receive the response that you expected to get, especially when your other maybe white male colleagues did the same thing.
Yeah.
I worked at a institution in housing and I was in the mid-level. So, if you think about housing traditionally is structured, there's your entry-level staff. We call them hall directors or, residence hall directors. Then you've got your mid-level staff, typically our assistant directors, and then you've got your director of residence life or of housing and residence life. And so I was an assistant director at that point, and I supervised hall staff. And so part of my role is accountability, unfortunately.
Yeah.
That's the difficult part when you are a woman leader is having to hold people accountable. Unfortunately, I think we draw back to this expectation of me to teach and to be mothering to my staff. I'm expected to make my staff more like comfortable and happy and healthy and usher them through this role and be a mothering figure for them. And I knew that to be true because when I attempted to document one of my staff members, it became an issue, enough so that I had to go through every level in not only my department, but in my division to vet that documentation, so that I could issue a letter of counsel. We're not talking I was trying to fire them. It's
just
a letter of
simple, let's
letter
have
of
a
counsel.
Conversation.
Right, to have a conversation and counsel the staff member appropriately, multiple levels of my institution, right? And at every level, I'm being asked to dot my I's and cross my T's. I'm being asked to reword things. I'm being asked to have additional conversations with the staff member in question. I'm being told that no one else in your department has documented someone, so why are you doing it? I'm being told that we just don't do that here. We encourage and uplift our staff, and this isn't encouraging or uplifting. And my response to that was the most responsible thing that I can do as a leader is to hold my staff accountable and is to uplift them through counsel. You are not allowing me to do that. So help me understand. Did my own back channeling and understanding of that process, and through that process was able to determine that not only was I the first woman to be able to document anyone in my department, I was the first Black woman to document anyone in my department. Every letter of counsel that had been issued in my department was issued by a white man. And every letter of counsel had never been reviewed by my director at that point.
Wow.
So I asked my director in our following meeting, because he was unaware that I had done this back channeling, of course, but when you're a woman in leadership, you have to be first knowledgeable, right?
Yes.
And then you have to be interconnected. So you have to know where you have to go, know where things are in your industry. You have to be able to know how to find those answers when they're not being provided to you. And so I went to my director and I said, I really need to understand why I am being asked to edit and go over this with a microscope. Said, well, whenever there are these documentations, our institution doesn't like these types of documentation because they make our staff feel that we don't believe in them. I said, it's interesting that you state, and these are my exact words, and I think this might have been why I got in trouble.
Knowing Bree, I know what she's about to say is 100% spot on.
I said, it's interesting that you talk about your staff feeling unsupported because I feel unsupported right now.
Right.
I said, I am well within my rights and my role to document my staff, and you are having me jump through literal hoops to do so. I said, in fact, the conversation and the counsel that I want to provide is not even a point anymore because it's been a month since I've submitted it to you.
Wow.
And I said, help me understand how you, as my supervisor, are empowering and supporting me to do my job in this moment. And he said, I feel that there's a tone And what you're saying, he said, I feel like there's a tone that you have an issue with the directives I've provided you. Now, this is where, you know, they freeze the frame and you say, like, this is where you had me messed up at. Like, yes. You know, like you're like reflecting automatically. This is where I knew that no matter what I did in this moment, he was, one, tone policing me. Mm-hmm. Two, skipping over the point that I was making by neglecting and deflecting from what I had asked him to do.
Right.
And three, that he had no intention of supporting what I wanted in this moment.
No.
Because if he had, he would have said that from the beginning, right? Yeah. So understanding that whatever hill that I was about to climb was either going to be a hill that I was going to scale successfully or a hill that I was going to die on. I chose violence that day and told him.
And well, you lived to tell about it.
Yes, and I lived to tell about it. And I lived to tell about it. I mean, because at the end of the day, you can't fire me for trying to do my job, right?
It's a procedure in place.
It's a procedure. There's a procedure in place. And I think this goes back to being knowledgeable, right? If I was not equipped with the knowledge that you're not going to fire me, and two, that I'm doing my job, and three, that the conversation I'm having with you, only you and I are present to talk about it. So we can take that where we need to. Yeah. And four, that I have on record documentation that supported this letter of counsel, because you always have to be knowledgeable and keep good receipts. That's where I was able to become empowered in that conversation. Had I not done that background work, I wouldn't know what it was like to have that conversation, to be armed with that information. So I wouldn't be able to tell him after our conversation was getting more spicy, wouldn't be able to tell him that I'm the only woman that has submitted documentation in our department's history. And I expect as a woman that I'm supported by my male supervisor.
Yeah.
Key words.
And they don't even get it, because one thing that it brought to mind for me is, let it have been you that needed the letter of counsel, it would have been issued quick, fast.
The letter would have been issued and my signature would have been in HR the next day.
Yeah.
Because that's how things work. And so understanding that those hurdles needed to be climbed, and understanding that if I had not done it, then someone else would have to fight that same battle, right? Mm-hmm. If I had not chosen that hill to die on, and ultimately had to have several conversations with my supervisor about my behavior in that conversation, then that would have been something that somebody else had to deal with. And again, my philosophy through higher ed is about creating access and about making sure that others have seats at the table after me. So I don't mind doing that, but I think that is definitely a pitfall of leadership and a pitfall of being in higher education in a time when things just didn't quite work out for me how I needed to. I think that was the moment also where I learned I needed to leave that position so that I could be better elsewhere.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Knowing when to go is so important.
Especially as women leadership, you have to know when you're the only person applauding for you, and you have to go where you're celebrated, right? And not where you're tolerated, where, you know, your presence is a diversity check mark. You have to go where sometimes in spaces where you are a diversity check mark, where you are kind of that check box, those are spaces where you can be celebrated as well. And those are spaces that you can make a niche for yourself and definitely persist in an effort to create that access. But I think sometimes we stay in those bad situations longer because we think that we are supposed to suffer for our art or for our work. And I don't believe in that. And I think as Black women, we can choose to move on in a way that is respectful of the work that we wanted to do, and in a way that maintains us and supports our personal development and allows us to recover from those spaces.
Yeah, I feel as though in most cases we stay longer because we've normalized the behavior that we are enduring day to day. And when I think back on like my conversations with my parents, right? They come from a different generation where you stayed in that job for 20 years.
Yes.
And I remember like years ago, I started out, I maybe like 2 jobs in or something. And I called my dad and I was like, Daddy, I got another job. I got a little bit more money. I'm excited. You think he would be excited for me? My dad was like, what do you mean you're leaving these people's job? They gave you a chance. And, you know, we're Jamaican, so the conversation was a little bit different, to be clear. But he was just so shocked that I'm leaving a job that I had been in for 2 years out of school. But I'm like, they weren't giving me any more money. I didn't see the path for me to go. And I didn't feel comfortable in this space that I was in. And then now he's seeing like, oh, wait, this is the new generation. Like, we don't stay in jobs for 20 and 30 years until we retire. And I think a lot of that comes in as, you know, Black and brown people, where we might feel or we've experienced it enough in different situations. We're like, well, we're just going to be treated this way wherever we go. And before we wrap up, I just wanted to make sure like we touched on this too, as far as like, I thought starting this, you know, podcast interview that it would be the difference being of belonging between being at a PWI versus non-PWI as a professional. But now I'm thinking it's more about the size of the organization, because there are studies out there about leadership and training for just staff in general. Size is one of those things that is used to measure that, you know, experience. And so I'm wondering if your sense of belonging has changed based on the size of your organization. And then to segue into your experience as being educated and going through the system on a different side and being a student, whether that's undergrad or grad, whatever program you want to use, because, you know, I'm a deer in headlights after my last couple of degrees, you know, what that feels like and feeling like you belong in these spaces.
Well, I think to go from the point of institution size as a marker for training and sense of belonging for staff, I think that matters. But I would also say that there are organizations with tons of resources out there, institutions with all the resources and the money available, and they train their staff well and still experience the same issues in terms of the retention and valuing of their women of color, of their Black women in spaces, right? I think about the NYUs, where their faculty, their Black women faculty wrote a letter basically stating, you got us here and paid us well.
What now?
What now, right? And so I think and there's a point to that. I think whether you work at an HBCU, at a Hispanic serving institution, at an Native Islander, American Indian serving institution, right? You will experience a certain level of kind of an understanding that maybe you don't quite belong, right? There is going to be some dissonance there of, okay, the person I am in this space aren't exactly meshing. How do I fit? And so as a student attending all PWIs, I was not exposed to an alternative until well into when I was already going to school. But the stories that I hear from my counterparts who also have attended institutions of higher education is that even at historically Black colleges and universities, there are very similar statements, and a lot of it is due to patriarchy in higher education.
That is correct. Yes.
And
HBCU grad.
No, I was waiting to say that.
It's I would say that is because higher education was only for men until the early 1900s. And then once it was opened up to women, it was mostly white women. And then with HBCUs, we had to educate our own, right? It was a lot of the classes available to women were at normal schools, were teaching colleges, right? Or nursing colleges,
nursing and teaching. That's
nursing and teaching was it.
That's all you got.
So when people come into the fold, I think of my STEM students. I think of, you know, the stories I hear from my colleagues who I went to school with who majored in, you know, business, or majored in accounting, or majored in marketing, or these really strongly largely male fields. Finance is a good example. I have a friend, she's an accountant. She tells me all the time that the education she received at the institutions of higher education mimicked what she got when she got in the real world, which is that she's going to be the only Black woman, and that there's going to be a lot of white men mansplaining her when she gets there. So that hub of understanding that, where she went to school, she says prepared her socially for when she entered the workforce.
Agreed.
And unfortunately, I kind of don't know what to tell students when I say pick your poison. Do you want to go somewhere where you have a really great social existence, where you feel welcomed, where you are allowed to thrive and develop as a person, and where you will get some of a very good real world education, but that when you leave here, you're not going to have people who look like you around the corner every day? How do you want to do that? Or do you want to go somewhere where you don't have people who look like you, where you are starved in many capacities socially, where you're getting an education, but that education is going to be difficult? You're going to have to persist. And you'll have to find those people in that way to better support you in that capacity, attending a PWI. But someone has to tell that story. And for me, that person who told that story for me was my step team captain when I was in 10th grade at high school. I'm just gonna be honest. She told me when I was thinking of where I wanted to go to school, she said, you're going to get up to Tallahassee, because I went to Florida State. You're going to get up to Tallahassee, and you're going to see this great institution across the tracks called Florida Agricultural Mechanical University.
Yes.
And it's going to be a really safe space for you. But you cannot forget that you got to go back across those tracks.
Go right back across
and go to Florida State. And that, in some capacities, I think specifically the Black Student Union, that helped me. I joined several organizations that really helped me, but you're not going to have that all the time. So how are you going to build the skills to move through difficult scenarios when you leave these colleges and universities? And so I answer your question by saying this, that someone has to be the person to tell the story. And I think we do that by this is a great example, right?
Great
Your podcast is a great example, but I also think in real life, dismantling the barriers we place between ourselves as Black women, and being authentic and open to have those conversations about where we've come from and where we want to go, so that future generations are educated and don't have to endure the same things. And can then begin to dismantle brick by brick the secrecy, shame, dissonance, and imposter syndrome that has upheld a lot of these institutions of higher education. Because if we don't believe that we belong there because no one told us that we do, we will continue to feel afraid as we enter these spaces, especially as we seek to be educated.
To bring it sort of full circle where we started, this is all still new to us.
Correct.
You know, we're 50, 60 years in, and yes, HBCUs have been around and things have happened before then, but just the real period of enlightenment and progress and those sorts of things for Black people is still in a very sort of vulnerable and I hesitate to say, you know, infantile stage. And there's a lot of work to be done. So one of the things that we advocate for here is going beyond this avenue or expectation of just personal responsibility to making it a collective. But I also think that the conversations are changing. When we did start having this liberation of Black women, it was all about empowerment. And that's sort of a pet peeve of mine. I don't want to see any more women's empowerment only.
Yes.
Because it has to be tactical. It has to be strategic. It has to be,
correct,
well thought out. And that is what we need. And I think that piece is a little newer. We're figuring out actually how to do it now, and not just to feel good and feel motivated about it. So again, I applaud you for being that pioneer and just recognizing the responsibility. There are plenty of Black women and men who are in these positions who don't feel like it's their responsibility to bring other Black people up. They are fine with being the only one there. They are comfortable with their position, or they have this mentality of, if I did it on my own, which we know no one ever does, but if I did it on my own, you can do it on your own too. So it's so many dynamics within our own community that we're also facing, and then it's external as well. So I think we're in a great place. It's just a lot of work to be done. So any final words of wisdom for us?
I don't like to think of I think of myself as a product of all the information that was poured into me. And so I will say that my wisdom is not my own. My wisdom was taught to me. And so you mentioned tactile and skill-based things. I think that we are entering a new Black Renaissance as it relates to the sharing of ideas. I think a lot of virtual spaces throughout these last 2 years, as we've been in a pandemic, have kick-started a lot more of that renaissance. The wisdom I have is that it's imperative that we don't forget our purpose as we are moving through a lot of difficult spaces. Our purpose is what is going to shine through on the negative days, are the days where we're being challenged. And I think that purpose is essential to cultivate new thoughts and ideas within ourselves. Continuously try to self-develop, continuously try to seek knowledge, and be able to demand your space in these institutions. And so I will just say that stand up for yourself and be the best version of you, and remember why you brought yourself here, and be able and open and self-reflective to that.
I love that message. And so thank you so much, Ms. Briyanna Jenkins, for joining us today on our podcast. Welcome to the 10K community.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
This was a great conversation, and we look forward to welcoming you back again one day.
Yes, I already have an idea for part 2.
Absolutely.
I was over here just thinking about it too.
Yeah, it's really the disciplinary action. So when you said you did that research, and I wondered who the recipients of those letters actually were. What did they look like? Because another goal here is to tackle at the institutional level what they need to do. And one of the areas that's highly discriminatory is in disciplinary action. Yeah. Because one, you tend to have majority white in leadership and minorities in worker level positions, employee level positions. So by default, there's an imbalance. And they are the recipients, employees who are coincidentally people of color, tend to be more disciplined. Absolutely. And especially in comparison to their white counterparts. So that is what I'm thinking about.
Let's do it. There's lots of research and stories.
Yes.
That we could bring together for that. I think that's a great topic. That's a good idea.
Well, thanks again. Have a good one.
Thank you so much. Y'all have a good one. Bye.